all
Perfect.
cousins here. Andrew's great-grandfather and our grandfather were brothers in Poland. Families lived nearby each other. They were friends there. They remained friends in the US. But before that, Stephanie was born in 1939, the year Germany attacked Poland. And she lived through the war years and through the forced labor camps and has a lot of direct memories. I was born in 1946, a year after the war ended. We were in the American Liberation Zone, thankfully, and awaited for immigration to the US. It was after the war, after World War I, that Poland was formed. So it was a very young country and developing its place in Europe. It was also 1920, 1930, during the years of the Great Depression. So they were hard years for everybody in the world. Our family was, I think, very normal in that region. They were farmers. They had many brothers and sisters in each of the generations. Many of them died because there was no medical attention. Many of them were needed to work the land, and they did have very large families. So our mother had how many siblings, Stephanie? Do you remember? Like
6 or 7.
6 or 7. And our father had 10.
And
Big families.
lots of kids.
Lots of kids. Lots of mouths to feed and lots of kids to work the land as they got bigger. They were very close families. They lived, I would say, not even villages, but hamlets. They were like collections, 6, 7, 10 houses, many interrelated. People really left during those years. There was not very much information about what else you could do. So they had their plot of land. And if it was good land, they were luckier than if it was bad land. But they did help each other out also.
So very close communities.
Very close and dependent. Yeah. Well, when my mother got married, she moved to Temne, which is another little village in the area. And this is a region that Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, Czechs, Jews lived in. It was a very mixed region in terms of population. Now it's in the Ukraine. It's about 100 miles from Lviv, 100 miles from Kiev. But in those years, it was part of the New Poland.
Okay. And about what dates was this? Like around what time would you say? It was the early 20s?
Yeah, Poland was formed after World War I, 1920.
1920, so about the 20s. Okay.
Yeah. And it existed as an independent Poland until after the war, when it became a communist state.
Yep. After it fell into the Russian hands. So what would have been kind of like everyday life in that little hamlet, that village? What was it like? I mean, you described it as very much farming and manual labor. Was there anything outside of that would happen?
Yeah, there was no cash economy there. People didn't earn money. So if you raised things and had a surplus or had something extra, you would walk to town, which was probably like 4 miles, to a larger town with a market and sell it. So if you had eggs or other things, but you would maybe trade it rather than sell it.
Interesting. No cash.
No cash, no schools, no hospitals, no newspapers, no radio.
So isolated. That's so. I guess that was our family aware of what was going on in Germany at all or is it just kind of like one day the Russians just showed up on their doorstep?
Father was called into the army shortly after the parents married. He was called into the army and to the German front, and the war didn't last very long. And so his regiment was broken up because they were in the cavalry and they were fighting the German tanks.
On horses.
Yeah,
Yeah.
horses. Yeah. So that was broken up very rapidly.
Yeah.
So he and a fellow soldiers walked across Poland
Wow.
so he knew exactly what was happening all through Poland, how devastating it was for Poland
To return you.
to return. Yeah.
That's crazy.
And when he got back and the Russian army went through and he had his revolver and they found his revolver and that the punishment was to be sent to Siberia. So that they were ready to be shipped there, except some kind of interference. I believe it was the German army. And so that's the reason we didn't wind up in there.
Our mother used to say the communist mantra was, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine.
That sounds very, very right, I'm going to say. So then I guess Germany attacks in 41. How did life change for our family after that change in, I'm going to say, regime change?
Again, I'm going to cite my mother. She said,
Yeah.
when the Germans were coming, they were all really happy because the Russians would be out. They thought nobody could be worse than the Russians. But in fact, the Germans were worse than the Russians. They took everything. They took every little thing they could get.
Wow. So it got a lot worse.
In 1941, it got worse. And then in 1941, 42, they started taking younger people to work in the German factories and lands.
Mm-hmm.
They started requisitioning Polish, Ukrainian, whoever was
labor.
There. Not the Jews, I think, from what I read.
They went into the extermination camps.
Yeah, the
Yes.
Jewish people.
That's a lot. So the Germans then came in and they took everything they could. How did I guess, like you said, we went into the woods. How did you live? How would you survive if you have nothing?
Well, what happened is that we were found by the Germans in the woods.
But after a while.
And we were taken into Germany in their cattle cars, which is my first memory. I was 3.5 years old. And I recall sitting on the floor. We were all on the floor. And both my sister and I, my sister Catherine, who's 2 years younger, had whooping cough. And one of the things as I recall doing, we had to cough into the pillows. We had some kind of pillows Mother brought with us. And I recall dry bread hanging from the ceiling. She had packed some dry bread to bring with us because of the journey, which really helped us a lot at that point.
Car, what do you recall?
I recall being in the camp, the labor camp, they called it. And the camps here were near the city and they had the name of the city. Do you recall the name of that camp? Okay. Barracks, wooden barracks and barbed wire, surrounded by wire with an SS guard at the gate. And the adults that were given the jobs, father was given a job in a beer factory and mother worked at a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And they would go out for the day. And the children, there were small children there. I started at 3.5. And I had a younger sister, 2 years younger. And we were taken into a room with one of the East European ladies, or a couple of them. And that's where we stayed during the daytime.
So she would just watch that was her job, was to watch all the children. And that's for your parents when they went to the factory and the hospital. So they left camp every day. They walked in and out of the camp. They weren't locked inside the camp. So you just went to work and came back. Is that correct?
You had to carry papers on you, and papers.
Papers.
Identification was asked at different different points. So you could not go out of your area.
And I didn't ask my mother, but I read later on that they were called Ostarbeiters, Eastern workers, and they had a patch on them that
So you,
identified them as such.
yeah, you had your wonderful papers, and then you had an identifying patch saying this is what you're doing. Okay, so
So how we survived, because they served the most horrendous food. I recall that coming with a bucket with, they had this soup that was so smelly. Turnip was one of the veggies in there. And it was so smelly that people couldn't eat it. It was just horrendous. So what we were allowed, there would be, I recall another family. And there were 4 of us, my parents, my younger sister, and then there were my mother's mother and father who were elderly in this particular room. And then there was another family with 2 young boys. And we were allowed a cooking pot. Each family had their own cooking pot. And they had food. Mother had 2 brothers and a cousin who were single, and those were working on farms. And the farmers knew that there were young children in these camps, and they would give them food. And they could bring the food. They couldn't bring it through the gate because everything was checked. Your handbag had to be open, whatever you carried had to be open. You couldn't bring anything in. They would bring it like at night, and under the barbed wire, they would dig a hole and they would get the food over that. Or sometimes like a bag of potatoes, they could throw it over the fence.
Over the fence.
And that's how we survived. We would have not survived otherwise. And other families also had that kind of system.
I think our family didn't have a lot of contact with Germans as such. And the contacts they had, I remember my mother saying that that she thought Germans were kind to her or nice to her, except for the SS officers and the military guards who were ferocious.
So this was just the everyday German was just kind of like living their life essentially, and then the captors were just terrible people.
Yeah, they terrorized the laborers.
Yes, one other saying she used to have was, "Don't blame the Germans, it's the government of the times."
My mother did have some contacts. She gave birth to a baby in the camp in 1944. And there was no medical care, no special help for anything. She had to work, she had the baby, she had to leave. She came back. The baby lived like 7 months.
Yeah.
And my mother had taken, when they left Poland, she took a sack full of possessions of her bedding, her pillows, her wedding dress. And when they realized the baby wouldn't live, she made a christening gown for the baby. And she said a Russian woman at the camp said, "You can have the baby baptized," because that was very important for her. And she said, "Go out, there's a mass in the morning at the German church. Just ask the priest to baptize." And she did that, and she got a woman at the church. She had a little baby in the christening gown, and a German woman who came out of the service at the church. My mother said, in her broken German words, baby and christen God. And so the German woman got the priest over and went in, and they baptized the baby.
Do you remember about the liberation when because you were living by the Americans, right? Because you're Allied territory. So do you have any memories of that?
I remember great joy we heard when everybody was very happy. And what they did, what happened was they opened up the magazines where you could go and get clothes and food. That was open up, and the public, whoever wanted to, just went out there and helped themselves.
Did though was truly amazing, because they got records of all the interned people and the survivors in these places from the German. I don't know how much work they must have spent on this, and they must have used Germans to translate these records, but they had volumes and volumes of records, and they tried to reunite families in displaced person camps. So those who were working in the fields had a record someplace, and those who were in the camps, and they got then put into a displaced person camp.
The camp that we finally wound up living in is called Wildflecken, and it's still there. It's used by the American Army. It's 10 miles long, and it housed East Europeans, all East Europeans, former laborers. Mhm. And Wildflecken was it was run by the Americans and the English, but it had East Europe people within the camp managing. It had 1,000 children. It had a school. I recall going to their school in Polish, and it was they had their own police force. It was very well run.
After the liberation, we had all of these American soldiers around the camps. I was tiny, I don't remember them. But you also had people who were imprisoned, who were poor, who had starved, who had really suffered for 5 years. And they see these wealthy looking American soldiers who want booze. So they put up stills. They started making vodka and trading it for blankets, for food, for leather,
boots.
Soldiers never change.
The people who came in were remarkable. Stephanie remembers the doctors, and everybody was malnourished, but Stephanie
more so.
Take it.
More so, yes. And they did have medical care for us. Like our other sister at that time, she got herpes of the eyes, and she was placed in the hospital where you couldn't go in because it was infectious. And she came out of that okay. She could see fine.
I give a lot of credit to the Americans who tried to run it and to their organizers there, because there were issues in the camp. Like initially, all of the East Europeans were going to be repatriated to their country of origin. So the Poles had to go back to Poland, the Ukrainians to Ukraine. There were Russian soldiers who had been interned there. They're supposed to go back to Russia. And guess what? Nobody wanted to go back.
Yeah, and another, for instance, I was placed in a hospital because I was malnourished. And one of the things they did there was force feed me because I actually didn't know how to eat, and I made it.
Coming to America after you got healthy and you were living in these displaced person camp, like how long did it take before you got to?
But there were uprisings in the camp by the people who had been resettled, the former forced laborers, struggling not to be sent back, blocking American administrators from doing this. And finally, it changed. It changed as a policy.
At the same time, the borders were being changed in Poland, both the East and the West. The Poland that we were in went into Ukraine, and on the other side, what was Germany came into to be Poland.
Okay, so Poland got and did anyone help you when you were here? Like, can you just describe your guys' experience of just coming and immigrating and then assimilating?
We had the Catholic Church paid for a trip here, which we needed to reimburse them, and the parents did reimburse them. And once we got here, we were settled on a farm upstate in Minnesota, and the farmer couldn't sustain another family. And so we couldn't stay there very long. So then we were moved to another farm, and we lived in a house which was partly destroyed by fire. And we had no electricity, no plumbing in it. And we stayed there for 3 years or something, 3 years, with very severe winters. Minnesota.
Yeah, it's still in Minnesota, right?
Yeah, it's snowstorms like you wouldn't believe.
We had an uncle who immigrated to Canada earlier. He was single, and Canadians were recruiting workers. He worked on the Niagara Falls tunneling or stuff like that. We had other cousins who immigrated to Venezuela, England,
Australia,
to come here was sort of like drawing the golden card, because everybody knew that in America, the streets are lined with gold, golden curves. My mother came here. She said she was almost after a certain point ready to go back.
Mm-hmm.
She was all alone. There was no more community, no more family around to help her. It was a hard, hard life. Our father worked on a farm, taking care of horses in the fields. He had to cut the wood for the wood burning stove in the winter. He had to take care of all of the needs for the farmer. We had a little garden. We had a cow that one of the neighbors let us use for milk for the children. I remember at this point, I remember my mother chasing the cow. The cow longed to go back up the road to its herd. So, I mean, people really tried to help in a limited way, but it was super hard.
It wasn't easier. It's like, it just seems like, so was that, I guess, my one question is, if you know, how was it chosen? Actually, how was it chosen to where you would go? Like, you get America, you get Canada, you get.
It's a beautiful process. Your family, I found original papers that you all were supposed to go to Louisiana.
Oh.
But you got somehow redirected. I think Montana was the first stop.
Yeah.
We were going to go to Chelsea, Iowa. And my understanding is, my mother said when they got here, somebody said, you know, how about Minnesota instead of Iowa? It's like, fine. Yes, it's America. A deep sigh of relief. And people,
because like, do you remember about the process?
People tried to be helpful, but it was actually, I think, individuals at the end who proved the most helpful. My mother met Polish Americans outside of St. Cloud. They helped her find a job that was a paying job outside of St. Paul, where she could go and work. Our father, in the meantime, was badly injured in a car accident where somebody ran him over. So it was very timely help for my mother from this family, and she stayed friends with them for years. And at the same time, right away, our family started sponsoring relatives of theirs to come to the United States, because you had to have somebody sign the paper that they wouldn't be dependent on the government for assistance for like 2 years or something.
Any final thoughts you would like to leave us with?
Well, it scars you for life. There's no way about it. I feel very scarred by what happened to me as a child. I have tried not to go in there, and I've tried to get past it. And I have to a certain degree, but it never leaves you. Never leaves you.
I can imagine why.
And as a child, I didn't think like I never had enough food. I just didn't eat. And then your stomach closes up and you just eat less and less. You don't think of that way. You must have a piece of food or something. It doesn't work that way for a child. After a while, you just numb yourself and go on.
It becomes normal. It's not abnormal because you don't. It's all you've known.
Yeah, I had food issues my whole life. Not until the last 3 years have I gained weight. I was very skinny my whole life. It only happened in the last 3 years that I've gained.
Wow. It stays with you. That's crazy. Do you have anything?
I think from my point of view, I didn't go through the horror of it. I just watched the effects of the horror on my parents. And you're not the same person after as you are before, whether it's dying young as a man, and 54 is young, or being very controlling as a woman because you've gone through a war. My mom was 18 when she got married. She was 19 when she had her first child. So she went through this, so she knew what was best in any occasion. And she's lived through it. So the controlling issue was there. So, I mean, you see it in different ways. And I really praise the American effort for what they did in Europe at the time, and for trying to get people settled, and the compassion and the flexibility to be able to understand different points of view, that you may have a law, but it's like a bell curve. You have edges that you have to, you're not going to deport this guy with 3 kids because he wanted to get more food for his family.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys sharing your stories with me. And I really want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day and passing this knowledge on.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
America and what was it